everyone, and thank you for joining the NeedyMeds special topic webinar, Samaritans Suicide Prevention. My name is Carla, and I am the Director of Education at NeedyMeds. And before we kick off today's really important presentation, I want to go over just a few tips. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can type them into the questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel. Just know that we will reserve answering questions until the end. If we don't have the time to answer your specific question, we will follow up with you personally via email by tomorrow afternoon. However, we of course will provide the contact information for NeedyMeds and more importantly, Samaritans, should you or a loved one need to reach out prior to us getting back in touch with you. In the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel, you will find a copy of my PowerPoint presentation, as well as the PowerPoint presentation put together by our guest panelist, who I'll introduce in just a moment, Rose. If you have difficulty accessing those, you can send me a message, again, in that questions section. Also, the heads up that this webinar is being recorded, and we will do our best to convert it quickly into a video and post it to our YouTube page so you can share it with your family or loved ones. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to just take a moment to talk to you about NeedyMeds for those of you that are not familiar with our organization. That slide just has our updated mission statement, which is that we are dedicated to educating and empowering those seeking affordable health care. Essentially, what NeedyMeds does is we connect people free and anonymously to programs through our website and helpline that will help them save on or afford their healthcare expenses. So I encourage you to check out needymeds.org. And if you are looking for help affording a healthcare expense, certainly including but not limited to medication, check out that website, but you can also reach out to our expert call center counselors at 1-800-503-6897. And of course, you can find that toll-free helpline on our website as well as on the last slide of our presentation. So with that, let's get started. One of the things I want to talk to you a little bit about before I introduce our guest, Rose, is Samaritans. If you're not familiar with Samaritans, Samaritans is an organization whose mission is to reduce the incidence of suicide by alleviating despair, isolation, distress, and suicidal feelings. In this webinar, you will learn about risk factors and warning signs for suicide, how to talk to someone who may be suicidal, and basic steps in getting a suicidal person help. Now, let me tell you a little bit about our panelists, and in the meantime, I'm going to keep that contact information for both Samaritans and NeedyMeds up there. So our panelist is Rose Chayette, who will be walking us through this information. Rose is the Manager of Community Education and Outreach with Samaritans, Inc. The full name, I keep referring to it as Samaritans, but the full name is actually Samaritans Inc. of Boston. And in this position, Rose teaches suicide prevention workshops to youth, adults, and elders throughout the greater Boston area. But as you imagine, of course, the information we're providing you with is not only applicable regardless of where you live, but Samaritans' contact information is also nationwide. So if you don't live in Massachusetts, don't worry, that toll-free helpline up there on your screen is applicable to you as well. Getting back to Rose, prior to holding this position as the Manager of Community Education and Outreach, she spent 2 years answering calls and texts on the Samaritan Helpline. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic and the screen, hopefully seamlessly, to Rose. And you may hear silence while we do that. And of course, feel free again to ask any questions you may have into that questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to Rose. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Carla, as always. And thank you to NeedyMeds for continuing to welcome us to have these webinars. So as Carla said, I'm the Manager for Community Education and Outreach with Samaritans, located in Boston. And our objectives for this webinar are here up on the screen. And I wanted to just put out there as we're getting started that this is obviously a pretty heavy topic. We're going to be discussing suicide very openly, and I don't know who is calling into the webinar right now. I don't know if anyone out there, if you yourself have been personally impacted by suicide, or if you're struggling yourself. So this can be triggering, this can be difficult. I just really encourage all of you, if you're feeling upset by the topic, or feeling like you actually need some support in the moment, please definitely take care of yourself. Maybe step away from the webinar. At the bottom of that screen there is the 24/7 helpline that my organization offers by call or by text. So that number will be on every single screen. So please reach out during the webinar if you need some help. Reach out after. We are always there. And we'll be looking at this today from the perspective of how do we support those at risk for suicide, whether it's a colleague, whether it's somebody we work with in a professional setting, family, friends, people we come across in the street. How do we prevent suicide in our general community? So a little bit more about what my organization does, and I'm really going to focus on that resource at the top that we've been mentioning. The other two resources that we provide are really just for the Boston and Greater Boston area. So our 24/7 helpline, like I mentioned, by phone or by text, it's completely confidential and anonymous and free. If people are reaching out to us, they don't have to share their name, their age, where they live, whatever they feel comfortable sharing. And I do think sometimes when people hear about a resource like this or other suicide prevention hotlines, people do sort of believe sometimes that it must only be a resource for people who are in a crisis or for people who are feeling suicidal. And while, of course, we get those people reaching out to us daily, what we find is that most people who are calling or texting us, they're actually not feeling suicidal in that moment, but they are feeling hopeless, they are feeling isolated, they're dealing with something really difficult in their life, and maybe they have support systems in place, but they still feel like no one's really listening to them, so maybe that's why they're reaching out to us. So, I think it's a great resource to know about for ourselves, to share with people around us, because we never know when something difficult might come our way, and we feel like, wow, I need some extra support, or maybe it's 2 in the morning and my usual support systems aren't there. I don't want to wake them up. Let me reach out to these people, even in the middle of the night. So I think it's a great resource to be aware of. So one of the first things that is important to discuss is how prevalent is suicide. So I want to just go over a couple of these statistics. Let me just see it there. I've got one more. So that top number there, that's how many suicides we know were reported in 2016, but we don't actually know the full numbers of how many people are dying by suicide, because sometimes there are situations where someone did in fact take their life, but it wasn't reported that way. So one example could be a drug overdose that was in fact a suicide but wasn't reported that way, perhaps a car accident that was a suicide, not reported as such. So we kind of don't know the full numbers, but there was a recent CDC report that came out a couple of weeks ago, and these numbers really are going up right now. So this really is a public health crisis, and I think it's something that not all of us really talk about very much. Second leading cause of death for youth, 10th overall. The leading method in the U.S. is firearms. We hear a lot about gun violence and firearms, and 2 out of 3 deaths that occur at the hands of a firearm are actually suicides, which I think a lot of people don't know. So that is something to know as well. And currently, middle-aged males, in particular white males, are the population that is dying by suicide the most. That last stat up on the screen I find a little interesting, which is that women actually attempt suicide more than men do, but men die by suicide at greater numbers. And the biggest reason for that is that men tend to use more lethal means, like firearms. Someone is probably more, potentially more likely to live through other types of suicide attempts. But with a firearm, it's not very often that somebody lives through a self-inflicted gunshot wound. So, not having access to a firearm that can be a way to prevent suicide. Just like putting a fence up on a bridge, another way to prevent suicide. So just something to think about. And I wanted to show this map here just because I know we have people from all over the country probably right now. And the darker the color there, the higher number of suicides take place. The lighter colors, less suicides occur. And, there aren't exact reasons as to why it is, there's a lot of things you can look at, isolation, maybe a lack of access to resources. But again, it comes down to firearms. Here in Massachusetts where I am, we have a very low rate of suicide, but some of our very close neighbors, they're the darkest blue there's some of the darkest blue on the map. We have stricter gun laws here in Massachusetts as opposed to there. So discussions of means and access to means really does play a role in this, as well as some other factors as well. So there's a lot of myths about suicide, and I believe that first one up here is something that really prevents this conversation from occurring. There truly is this belief out there that a lot of people hold that if you talk about suicide, if you ask somebody directly if they're feeling suicidal, and if they're not feeling this way, that suddenly the idea is in there, that suddenly they will consider that as an option. And it's actually been proven time and time again that by talking about it, by asking somebody the question, you really can't place that idea into somebody's head. What you actually might do is open up a conversation that person really needs to have. At Samaritans, because we are a suicide prevention organization, we ask every caller and every texter if they are feeling suicidal. And what we find is that a lot of people feel a huge sense of relief, almost like this weight has been lifted off of their shoulders, that they are being asked the question in a very honest and compassionate way. Because I think a lot of people who feel suicidal, maybe they're not willing to share it with someone. They might be willing to share it with someone, but only if they're asked the question. They might really need someone to kind of meet them in the middle. So I don't assume that all of you in the webinar will leave here today and feel 100% confident talking about this subject or broaching the subject with someone that you're worried about. The one thing that I really hope you'll be empowered by and leave with is knowing that if you talk to somebody about this, if you ask the question, you really won't put the idea into their head. You might actually be preventing suicide at the end of the day if they are feeling that way, because you might be opening up a conversation that they really, truly need to have. And I also want to just have you all look at the bottom one there. I think a lot of people sometimes believe that it's only professionals that can help someone who is suicidal. You have to have a certain kind of training. And here at Samaritans, we actually have teenagers as young as 15 years old who are volunteers on our helpline, answering those phone calls, answering those text messages. They're teenagers. They are not professionals. But what they've been trained in is how to be a really excellent listener, how to show empathy, how to ask directly about suicide, and then know what steps to take if the answer to that question is yes. So I truly believe that as long as you're a good listener, you're compassionate, you're empathetic, and know where to turn if it turns out that somebody is suicidal, that with those tools, anyone can truly help someone if they are dealing with this. So I don't know if anyone has noticed out there, but as I've been speaking so far in this webinar, I haven't been using the word commit. I haven't said commit suicide, which is kind of the language that we generally hear when we do discuss suicide. And suicide it's really complicated, and it's not actually about wanting to end the life. It's about wanting to end the pain. It's about somebody feeling like maybe they actually don't want to die, but they just don't feel like they can continue on living with all of this pain that they're feeling. And I think the word commit has so much intent behind it. Like the way that we use it, there's intent, there's thought process. You commit a crime, you commit a sin, you commit to a cause, commit to a relationship. There's true intent behind it. And when I think about someone who's feeling suicidal, I sort of envision them in this really dark tunnel, and they don't see any way out of this tunnel, and they're so clouded by this pain. and just so hopeless and can't find any hope to continue. And my thought is, if they're in this dark tunnel, can they make decisions that have true intent, that have true thought process behind it? A lot of people believe that their judgment is really clouded by all of that pain. So people in suicide prevention are actually trying to change the language from saying commit suicide, which also has a very sort of negative connotation, I think, to saying that somebody died by suicide or somebody took their life or somebody killed themselves. I always like to put it out there because I think that there's so much confusion and there's so much complexity to suicide, and the language that we use can build to the confusion and the stigma and the prejudice. So I always want to put that out there. Unfortunately, when we do talk about suicide, that's kind of the only language that we hear. I've seen some news outlets really starting to adopt the preferred language, but just something to think about as we talk about this. So we're going to briefly discuss risk factors now, and risk factors are not causes of suicide because there's not one single thing that does cause suicide, but it's more contributing factors that can build up for someone. So here on the screen, this is not an all-encompassing list of examples of risk factors, but this is sort of a good list to work off of, and different populations might face different risk factors. So the risk factors facing youth might be very different from the risk factors that are facing elders, but of course there's absolutely, can be crossover. I do think sometimes people truly believe there's one cause of suicide. One of the examples that I hear a lot is the one I have up here about bullying and cyberbullying. Sometimes you hear in the news an incredibly sad story where they say that maybe a boy was getting bullied in school, so then he took his own life. And it's sometimes presented as this direct cause and effect, that this one thing absolutely caused this other thing. And it's generally more than one risk factor, more than one thing that is causing someone to actually attempt suicide. And especially with an example like that, I think it's almost kind of dangerous to tell youth that bullying causes suicide. When I go into schools and I talk to kids about this, I always ask them, everyone who gets bullied, are they all suicidal? And they're like, of course not. So it's not a cause and effect. It's more than one thing. What can happen is maybe you have someone who's been dealing with a lot of risk factors that have been building throughout the course of their life. Maybe it's that things were generally going fine, but then there's a whole bunch of risk factors and difficult things that all took place at the same time, or in a very short amount of time, like a perfect storm. So what can happen is you have this individual dealing with some risk factors. What can happen is on top of that, maybe they have no support, or if they have support, maybe they just don't actually feel like anyone's supporting them. Maybe they don't have any coping skills, or if they have coping skills, maybe they're just unhealthy coping skills. And then on top of that, generally speaking, some type of mental illness is involved, particularly a mood disorder like depression, bipolar, things like that. That's not to say that a mental illness causes suicide, not at all, but they do estimate that 90% of people that died by suicide had a diagnosed or undiagnosed mental illness. So mental illness does play a big role in this, and if you can imagine a person dealing with all those risk factors, they don't have the support, they don't know how to cope, they're dealing with a mental illness, that can start to really build up and can start to feel like this is just way too much. I can't deal with these things anymore. I don't want to deal with these things anymore. And at this point, I don't want to be here anymore. And if that's the case where someone's really saying they just don't want to be here anymore, there often are warning signs. Now, there aren't always warning signs when there is a suicide. There are estimates out there that 70 to 80% of the time the person was exhibiting at least a couple of warning signs, but again, it's not always the case. But because they do believe that oftentimes there are, or after the fact when there is a suicide, sort of looking back and realizing that there were changes, I think it's important for all of us to be aware of what some of those warning signs can be. Again, this is not an all-encompassing list of warning signs. These are just a few examples. So I encourage all of you to maybe do a little bit more research after this, just to get, see what more examples can be. But the first category that often we have is verbal statements. Somebody might actually be directly making a statement, like some of the ones on the screen. What's the point of life? I'm a burden. No one would miss me if I were gone. I want to kill myself. I don't want to wake up tomorrow. People make jokes sometimes. People actually make kind of bizarre jokes about death, about dying, about suicide. And, I think often if we hear a joke, we assume it's just a joke or they're having a bad day. And I really encourage all of you to not always assume that it's a joke, because sometimes people say things and they're trying to see how we're going to react, or they're trying to figure out, is anybody listening? Is anybody hearing me? So, if you hear somebody make a joke about death or about suicide, check in with them and say, I heard what you said, or I saw what you put on Facebook, or I saw that comment you wrote in that email. I'm worried about you. Are you okay? And if they really were just kidding and they're not feeling suicidal, they might get mad at you. They might be kind of weirded out potentially, but at least for me, I'd honestly rather have somebody get kind of mad at me, or I'd rather feel a little bit embarrassed for a few minutes, but know that I took an extra step to check in with someone. It just never hurts to check in with someone if we hear something potentially concerning. So in addition to the verbal warning signs or verbal statements, in terms of some behavioral changes, withdrawing from friends and family, from society, performance at work or at school is faltering. They're not showing up at school. They're not showing up at work. For kids, a lot of times they're going to the nurse's office all the time with physical ailments, but it's actually emotional things that are going on too. Loss of interest is a big one. Sleeping a lot, never sleeping. Eating a lot, never eating. That one in here, sort of in the middle, where it says sudden mood lift after a down period, because that one isn't quite as obvious, I want to explain. If there's a person who operates at a pretty low level, let's say, maybe they in fact are clinically depressed, maybe not, but they often seem kind of down, kind of low, and then there's a spike and they suddenly seem pretty happy and elated, perhaps. Well, it could mean that they are getting help. It could also signify that maybe they've actually come up with a plan and they're seeing a way out of that pain. They see an endpoint to that pain. So they're actually feeling kind of better because they realize they won't have to deal with this for too much longer. That is such a hard one. It goes against the natural way that we all would think. And again, it could be that they actually are getting help. I just think it's an important one to think about. Risky activities, substance use, putting affairs in order, mood swings. A lot of these, some of you might know, are also warning signs for depression. And also, a lot of these are things that can be normal, like giving away belongings and possessions. I know a lot of people who are even in their 30s, 40s, not even elders, who are trying to not feel so cluttered and get rid of things. Yet it's also a warning sign for suicide. So it's extremely difficult to know whether these warning signs are warning signs for suicide, if it's something else that's going on. The only way we'll know is if we really talk to someone, if we kind of acknowledge what we're seeing and say to them, I noticed in meetings lately you've been sleeping all the time. You look really exhausted. Or I used to see you at church every Sunday and I haven't seen you for weeks now. Are you okay? Or whatever it is that you're seeing, just putting it out there and saying, I see you, I'm noticing this. Do you want to talk about anything? Are you okay? And if it really turns out that what you were seeing were actual warning signs for suicide, just like with asking the question directly about suicide, you might be opening up a conversation that they really needed to have. Maybe they, again, weren't willing to offer up all of their challenges. They needed someone to ask them directly. With the warning signs, typically there's more than one that somebody is exhibiting or expressing, and it usually doesn't happen overnight. They find that it's usually over about a 2-week sort of minimum period, but it's often a little bit longer. And these are just some emotions that a suicidal person may be feeling can be like, like with so much we're talking about on this webinar, nothing is very black and white. It's gray, it's fuzzy, but these are how some people might be feeling. So in this sort of little visual, I just want to show how when we're looking at a person and events in their lives or things they're dealing with, things can build up for a person to the point where it kind of feels like they're actually drowning. So I'm going to bring up events that sort of hypothetical events that are taking place in this individual, female, age 60. So mother dies age 30. That's where the water level is. We've got some more, high stress job that starts, gets a divorce, diagnosed with depression at this point. And maybe some of these things are related to one another. Maybe they're separate. Maybe things could have been prevented with certain kinds of supports in place. Maybe not. Unfortunately, breaks hip at 50, addicted to painkillers. And then at age 60, starts having thoughts of suicide. So as we're looking at this image up here, it's just sort of to help us visualize that people can carry around a lot inside that maybe we don't see. And maybe we see that someone is struggling in some way with one thing, but we don't know just how much they have on their plate. We may not know their personal story behind the events or what they're dealing with. It's important for us to realize that although we may think it's one little thing that someone we know is going through, to them it might actually be making them feel as though they're drowning. So at the end of the day, we really shouldn't judge people. We shouldn't make assumptions about people, I think. That's hard to do sometimes, but we simply can't see the stressors, the pain, the difficulty that people are carrying around. So what we really have to do is sort of take people as they are and listen, and figure out what are these things. Is somebody actually at the point of feeling like they're drowning? And I want to take a second here just to bring something up because, suicide has really been something that's been discussed a lot in the last couple of weeks. There have obviously been 2 very high-profile celebrity suicides, and I wanted to just touch on that a little bit in relation to this visual we have up on the screen. Even though I work in suicide prevention, I really found that this discussion about suicide, it's permeating everything outside of my job. It's all over the news, social media, people talking to me. It's really been in the discussion a lot. And I think a lot of people are truly wondering and sort of speculating, how could, these 2 individuals, Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain, how could these 2 celebrities who seemingly, quote unquote, had everything, how could they end their own lives? And I think just like with the visual up on the screen, despite outward appearances, we truly don't know a person's pains, their joys, their failings, their feelings. Everyone has demons in some way, shape, or form. I think we all know this, but we forget it sometimes. And I've heard a lot of concern in addition to the conversation. I've heard a lot of concern about the potential for what they call suicide contagion, sometimes referred to as the copycat effect as well. Basically, suicide contagion is a term used to describe the exposure to suicide or suicidal behaviors within a family, a peer group, or through media reports of suicide, which could actually result in an increase in suicide and suicidal behaviors. And, with these 2 suicides, high-profile suicides that were very close together, those sometimes have a much greater impact on people than the less well-known individuals because the impact feels closer when it's someone in the public eye. We feel we know them, and we make assumptions about their lives. And if there's someone out there who's already vulnerable, who's maybe even having thoughts of suicide, they may see those celebrity deaths and think, wow, if that person, with all their success and their fame and their money, if they can't make it, gosh, what hope is there for me? It can be really triggering and could even be sort of a precipitating event that could push someone over the edge. So I wanted to mention those because it's been in the lexicon a lot. People are talking about this a lot. I think it's incredibly tragic. Suicide prevention helplines throughout the entire country have seen an increase in people reaching out. I think our numbers at Samaritans were about 40% higher after Kate Spade passed. And then on the Friday, where we all found out about Anthony Bourdain, it was up to about 60 to 65% increase in our helpline. And then the following week, the numbers were still really high. So, people are reaching out to, people are reaching out to these resources in the wake of these really tragic events. I wanted to just talk about that briefly. We all hope in different ways, and this might sound kind of silly, but I really encourage all of you to, at some point, either right now or maybe after the webinar, just jot down 3 to 5 things that you yourself do to cope with stress or pain. We all lead really busy lives, and it's so important to know what are the things that can help me and actually do those things. And plus, if we're supporting people professionally, personally, in our relationships, our colleagues, the people we interact with in our jobs, we can't take care of all of these other people if we're not able to take care of ourselves. So just something that I want you all to think about, especially after this webinar with such a difficult topic, I hope you will do a little bit of self-care. Okay. So what we'll be discussing now is, what do we actually do if we're worried about someone? So maybe we don't know if someone is feeling suicidal, but maybe we have kind of a gut feeling that someone's not okay. Maybe we know those risk factors, or we've seen the warning signs. We just have that gut feeling, and maybe you want to have a conversation with someone. So this is sort of a very, very mini version of some of the things that we teach our volunteers so that they can be as supportive as possible to those that are reaching out to us. So if you're speaking to somebody, let's say it's face-to-face, you really have to show that you're listening. And a lot of these things, I think, are very obvious. You want to make eye contact, you want to have good body language, good posture, putting away distractions like a phone or anything else that can be distracting, nodding your head. A lot of these things are obvious, but sometimes we forget how to show that we're listening. And I know I can tell when I'm talking to someone and they're thinking about other things, or they're distracted by whatever's happening around us, or distracted by their phone. So I think it's something important to think about, because if someone's really upset or vulnerable, they really need the full attention. And so utilizing some of these skills, I think, is really important. If you're speaking on the phone and you really want to show that you're listening over the phone, doing what we call verbal nods, which is like, I hear you. You want to interrupt them, but you want to make sure that they realize that you're still there. And then in terms of some of the don'ts, things that sort of inhibit listening, these first 2 up on the screen, they're really difficult. So, even for me, I struggle sometimes with not talking about myself. We always want to talk about ourselves. I think that's pretty normal. But if you're speaking to someone and they're sharing a situation they're in or a problem they're having, maybe you start thinking about, oh, I have been through something similar. I've been through this. Maybe you want to say to the person, I completely understand. But what if you don't truly understand? And what if that person who's opening up to you is running into this problem with everyone they're opening up to? Maybe everyone is saying, oh, I totally understand, when I was in that situation, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not saying that we should never relate to others. I think it can be really wonderful to help someone understand that, you've been through something similar, you might partly understand, but I think that we just do it really quickly. So I encourage you all to sort of fight the urge to talk about yourself or reflect on your own experiences when you're speaking with someone. Maybe eventually you want to share it, but in that moment, I just encourage you to continue to listen and let that person have their time. The same with giving advice or problem solving. It's so hard when we hear a problem. When I hear a problem, the first thing my brain starts to do is I go into fix-it mode. I want to fix that problem. I want to give advice. But that, too, can be problematic, because if I'm listening to someone and they're telling me their problem, and now I'm going into advice-giving mode, I've actually stopped listening to them completely because now my brain is focused on, okay, what advice can I give them? How can we fix this problem? So I do think there's a time and a place for giving advice, but I also think that, again, with the talking about ourselves, we do it really quickly. I encourage all of you, the next time you're speaking to someone who's upset or struggling with something, fight that urge to give the advice. And maybe eventually in the conversation, you do want to say to them, or maybe you want to even ask them, what do you think would help you most right now in this situation? Do you want to try to fix this problem? Because I have some advice that I could give you, but it might not work. I'm not sure if it'll work. It's what I would do if I were you. Or do you feel like you don't even want to try to fix this right now? Do you need to just vent and kind of get this off your chest? And maybe they say, I just need to vent. I can't even think about trying to fix this right now. Or maybe they say, yeah, actually, I'd love to hear your advice. And then, always practicing that advice with, this is what I would do if I were you, but I'm not you. I'm not sure it's going to work. And if they say they don't want advice, I would say respect that and just kind of move on. If you're doing your listening, you of course want to continue to move the conversation along by asking questions. Ideally, open-ended questions that can't be answered with a simple yes or no. So, questions with what or how, what feels like the hardest thing for you right now? How did that make you feel? What's helped you in the past? You want to avoid why questions. It can get really tricky, but sometimes asking somebody a why question, why do you think you're feeling this way? Why did you do that? It can feel a little bit judgmental. The person might actually feel like they have to defend their actions or their feelings. And there's a very good chance that they don't actually know why. And by asking a why question, you're really looking for the answer, but they might not even know. So trying to reword questions can get a little bit difficult, but I think it's important to sometimes avoid using those why questions. You definitely don't want it to be an interrogation. The 80-20 rule is something that we strive for at Samaritans. What it means is the person who is reaching out to us, they speak 80% of the time, and we on the other end of the line speak 20% of the time. Obviously, it does not always work that way. Sometimes people only give a little bit and you have to give a lot to try to, see if they'll open up. The ratio can be all over the place, but I think it's a good baseline to work with and really let that person have their time to speak. And honestly, it's okay to not know exactly what to say. Maybe you don't know what to say and you share that and you say, gosh, I don't even know what to say right now, but I'm just so glad you told me. Or I can't even imagine what you must be feeling right now. I don't even know what to say, So even that compassion might be more than they've received from anyone else. So if you're really worried with, I don't know what I'm going to say, I don't know what to do, letting the answers come from them and let them guide the conversation, and just being honest and saying, I don't even know what to say, but I'm so glad you came to me. I mean, that's a really wonderful thing to say to someone. So perhaps you're speaking to someone and they are expressing a lot of sadness, a lot of hopelessness, a lot of helplessness. You might really feel inclined to ask them directly about suicide. So I have a couple of examples up here of ways that you could phrase the question. With all of these iterations up here, it's a really direct question. This really is a yes or a no. I suppose some people do answer with I don't know, and that's okay. But you don't want the answer necessarily to be ambiguous. Some people prefer to ask, are you having thoughts of harming yourself? But harming oneself might be really different from suicide. So I do think it's important to ask the question directly and be ready to engage with that person and speak to them, whether they say yes or no. If I ask someone the question, and one thing I wanted to mention I forgot to say is, if I am going to ask someone if they're feeling suicidal, I first like to thank them because, chances are we've been speaking about other things. And maybe I want to say to them, thank you so much for coming to me. I can see how much pain you're in right now and how much you're struggling. And I want to ask you, are you having thoughts of suicide or have you been feeling suicidal? It can be asked in a sort of gentle tone, a gentle way, leading in with that acknowledgement of this is so hard and I'm hearing what you're telling me. And because I'm hearing what you're telling me, I want to ask this question. If that person says to me, no, I'm not feeling suicidal, what I don't want to say to them is, oh, I'm so relieved, thank goodness. Even if I'm feeling that inside, and I probably will be feeling a lot of relief inside, I actually don't want to express that relief because, first of all, unfortunately, they could be lying. I could ask the question and they say no, and it's actually a lie. We can't control people's responses, so I wouldn't want to say to them, oh, thank goodness, because then if they ever wanted to tell me the truth, they're probably not going to open up to me. And plus, it just builds to the stigma, I think, and the confusion and the judgment about this. So if someone says, no, I'm not feeling suicidal, just say, thank you for sharing that with me and asking a follow-up open-ended question. So the information on this slide, there's a very good chance you may never do this, but I just want you all to know how the conversation could go if you were to ask someone the question and they said yes, they were feeling suicidal. This is essentially how we risk assess our calls at Samaritans. We're trying to figure out where is this person at sort of on the grand scheme, because some people have suicidal ideation, but they never have even once thought about the how or the when, but they have those thoughts. And then we have the other end of the spectrum, someone who is having the suicidal ideation, but they have thought, they have made a plan. They've thought this through a little more. So if I ask someone, are you feeling suicidal? And if they say yes, the next question I would ask them is, have you thought about how you might take your life? And if they say yes, I'm going to ask them, are you comfortable sharing that with me? Maybe if I'm asking someone, they say, yeah, I'm gonna take a bottle of pills. So then I'll ask that person, okay, do you have access to those pills? For many people, the risk assessment, at least for us, often it stops there. Maybe they say, I want to take the pills. I'm gonna, use a firearm, do whatever it is. But maybe they actually don't have access. For us, they're at a much lower risk. They don't have those means that they have thought about using. But in this sort of hypothetical situation we're working with, maybe they say, yes, I do have access to pills. I have them in the medicine cabinet. Then I would ask them, okay, have you thought about when you might take your life? And, you might get a range of answers. It might be in 6 months. It might be, I don't know. It might be, I'm going to take it tonight. The answers can really be a range. For us, we really, we're concerned about anyone who's feeling suicidal, but if someone actually, if all these boxes are checked and someone is saying they're going to do it now, they're going to do it when we get off the phone, it's within this 24-hour period, that's someone that we really consider to be at a high risk, at an imminent risk for suicide, and that's a pretty serious situation. What we do in those situations, if someone is really at this high risk, we do this thing called a safety plan with them. A lot of clinicians do these with patients of theirs who are suicidal. There's a template down in italics at the bottom of the screen. You can go find the template online. But it basically sort of is a form that a person will fill out. They wouldn't fill it out while they were kind of in a suicidal crisis. They fill it out when they're feeling okay and can kind of think clearly. And it's almost just like this plan that they can go down to figure out, how am I going to keep myself safe? What triggers my suicidal thoughts? What can I do to take my mind off of this? Who can I reach out to? Who can I ask for help? Are there any professional resources? Do I have to change my environment to make it safer? The last thing on the page is usually, what is one thing that's most important to me and worth living for? And, if we think back to how I described how I view someone who's suicidal, kind of in that dark tunnel, if they're so clouded by that pain and that crisis, they might not even be able to remember what will help me, who can I reach out to. I've certainly spoken to people on the helpline before who are so deep in that pain that they were having trouble thinking of their coping skills and having trouble thinking of who they could reach out to or what they could do. With a little bit more of a conversation, they often came to those conclusions themselves. But I think it's a good resource to know about, this thing called safety planning. If you're speaking to someone and you have found out that they are feeling suicidal, of course, you're probably not going to feel very calm. You're going to be maybe freaking out and getting really upset and really worried. And I think it's important to show on the outside that you're calm, because you have to believe that that person who's just opened up to you about how they're feeling, they're up at a 10. Their anxiety, their pain, their fear, it is really elevated. And if they see that you're also getting really worked up, it might sort of make them feel less inclined to talk, or might just escalate the situation. So even if you are understandably freaking out a bit on the inside, I think it's important to show on the outside that you're calm. Give yourself permission to be human. You certainly do not have to be the expert or have all the answers. Self-care, debriefing, knowing that you're not alone. There are others to support you. And, if someone's life is at risk, it's really too big of a risk to keep to yourself. I do believe, even if the person that you're speaking with believes that you're going to keep this confidential, if it really is, suicide, which is can be a life or death situation, I think it's important to reach out to other support systems. If it's a workplace, follow protocols. If it's in the family, other family members, counselors, therapists, doctors, reaching out to local emergency services, calling Samaritans. We have actually, in the past few weeks, since those high-profile suicides, we've had an uptick in what we call third-party calls, which is essentially someone who's reaching out to us, not because they're struggling themselves necessarily, but because they're worried about somebody else. So we are always there to sort of be there to kind of bounce ideas off of and get some support in how do I help this person in my own life. Police can do safety checks. That's a really scary thought, to think I'm going to call 911 on someone if it seems like life or death. But I do think if it seems like life or death, sometimes that's the best option. I really do. These are a couple other resources. The middle number there, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, they offer support in other languages as well. I don't have the full list. I know, of course, Spanish and a slew of other languages, so they have translation services. Because Samaritans is a volunteer-based organization, while we certainly have a lot of volunteers who speak other languages, we're only able to offer it in English, at least at this point. But the NSPL line does have other languages available. The last couple things I just wanted to mention was that, I said a couple slides ago about calling 911 or reaching out to other family, doctors, resources, whoever. And I know that a lot of times, if someone comes to us, assuming it'll be confidential, and we break that confidentiality, we're so worried, this person will never speak to me again, this person will never trust me again. How could I do this to this person? This is something that I come up against a lot when I speak to kids, because kids tell each other about their problems, their fears, having thoughts of suicide. Friends tell each other these things all the time, and it's always with, you can't tell anyone, this is a secret, cross your heart, hope to die, all of those things. And I always tell kids, if a friend tells you they're feeling suicidal, you really have to tell an adult. And they're always like, no, I could never do that. I could never ruin my friendship. And what I always say to them is, yeah, but you'd rather have a friend who's alive and mad at you than a friend who's not here anymore. And even though that's what I say to kids, I say it to adults as well, because I think it's completely applicable for all of us, whether it's professional relationships, romantic friends, clients, whoever it might be. I just think it's important to realize that thoughts of suicide are often temporary, but suicide itself is permanent. And a lot of times getting some help, even some time, can really help somebody not feel that way anymore. But if you're finding out someone is suicidal, it's just too much to carry around on your shoulders alone. It's really important to reach out to those resources. And the last thing I'll just say is, we all have limitations in how much we can do. Obviously we wish we could sometimes control other people, but we simply don't have that power. We have limitations, and I believe that suicide is preventable. I also know that we can't always prevent every suicide. So I know those are kind of in conflict with each other, but I think it's important to mention. And I do think with more education, knowing how prevalent suicide is, knowing how risk factors can build up for people, knowing what some of those warning signs can be, and then also not being afraid to ask somebody directly about suicide and then getting some help, along with the compassion, the empathy, the listening. With all of those tools, I think we are all better able to help people and even prevent suicide if that's where somebody's at. Please reach out to our helpline, call, text, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We are always there. I am going to attempt to pass this back to Carla.
Actually, Rose, I was going to say you can go ahead and keep that right on your screen.
Oh,
because
okay.
Yeah, because all my screen would have had was the contact information, but yours is a lot more thorough.
Okay, great.
So, of course, Rose, thank you so much for that really important webinar, and thank you to our audience for taking time out of your day to learn these important tools. A couple of things I do want to remind you is that if you do have questions, you can type them into that question section of your GoToWebinar control panel. And again, if Rose doesn't get a chance to answer your specific question, she will get back to you, or another representative of Samaritans will get back to you via email. But please don't wait. If you or someone you know is in crisis, there's that contact information right on your screen. While the questions are coming in, I'd like to make a couple of really important points, which is that I've had the privilege of seeing Rose in person give this presentation, and also to be present during these webinars that she so generously gives to our NeedyMeds audience. And one thing I really want to stress is, once you become familiar with certain things, such as don't throw around that terminology like, oh, it's a terrible day, I just want to kill myself, not being too afraid to ask somebody if they're doing okay. It certainly applies to people in crisis situations. But what I've realized after listening to Rose a couple of times now is that a lot of these tools are really applicable to your everyday life and to everybody that's just having a hard time. The compassion, the empathy, and most importantly, the skill to simply listen is applicable way beyond just a crisis situation. And I'm saying that because if you, a loved one, a coworker, hasn't had the chance to join us today, please do encourage them to check out the NeedyMeds YouTube channel, where they can see a recording of this webinar. With that, Rose, I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple of questions that are coming in. The first one, and you sort of you did address this, but I feel driving it home in this way will be important. We have an audience member asking, if I ask someone if they are suicidal, can I put that idea into their head?
Yeah, no, I'm glad that someone has asked that, and I know I brought it up, but I want to reiterate that asking the question, it's really not going to place the idea into someone's head. I mean, for someone to be in that place, it's a really dark place to be in, and you can't, just by asking it, just by talking about it, can't make them suddenly feel that way. Even if someone's really struggling, even if they are depressed, I know a lot of people in my own life who deal with depression, really like clinical depression, and they struggle, but they never have felt suicidal, and even though they've been asked the question. So, I think there's a range, but I definitely want you all to know that, again, by asking the question, you can't place the idea into someone's head, and you might, in fact, be opening up a conversation that they really, truly want to have. I know some people also get worried, am I going to offend this person? Will they get mad at me, if they're not feeling this way? And, I've actually asked a family member this question before, and they did get kind of mad at me, and I felt like I'm so glad I asked the question, because I was worried, and even though they were mad at me, I hope that they felt like this person, cared enough to ask the question, and eventually they got over it and they were fine that I asked it. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you for that thorough answer. And thank you for always breaking it down into a way that lay people, such as myself, probably much of our audience, that we're not familiar with this topic, that you break it down into ways that really we can get our heads around and make it applicable in our lives. I actually have two questions coming in from different spectrums, spectrums on age. The first question coming in is, what if you do if someone is constantly saying they want to die, but it's more because of old age, and they're saying things like, I've done everything I want to do? So I'm going to field that question to you, and then I actually have another question, which is the other end of the age spectrum.
So I think that's a really tricky one, because a lot of elders do express, I've done everything I want to do, I've seen everything I want to see, I want to see, I'm done. And sometimes they're saying it just because, and I think sometimes they say it because they truly don't want to live anymore. And I think the only way we'll know if they're actually feeling like they truly want to end their life is by maybe saying to them, gosh, I'm hearing you say that you've seen everything, you've done everything, you just feel like you don't want to be anymore. Is it that you're actually having thoughts of suicide? And maybe they say, no, are you crazy? No, I was just sort of making a comment. Or maybe they do admit that it is suicide, and then maybe going through those steps of figuring out, wow, have they actually thought about how, or have they thought about when? I think, again, sort of opening up the conversation and really diving in, or even just saying, what do you mean by that? Like when you say you've seen everything, you don't want to even wake up tomorrow. Like, what do you mean by that? Tell me more about that. Just kind of opening up conversation, because I think you might find out from them whether it's just sort of an offhanded comment or it's actually something that they are feeling.
Thank you, Rose. Very helpful. And I want to take a brief moment to say that some audience members are writing in that they have been personally affected by family members or loved ones that they've lost to suicide. So please know that we extend our deepest condolences, and thank you for taking time to learn more about this important topic and share that. The more we speak to each other, the more we learn. Getting back to that other.
Can I just say one thing, Carla?
Absolutely.
For those of you that are sharing that you have lost someone, obviously I'm deeply sorry for that loss, and I know we do have people from all over the country. If you happen to be in the Boston or greater Boston area, one of the resources that we do provide are grief support services, specifically for people who have lost someone to suicide. We have these meetings that we call safe place meetings. It's basically drop-in, it's peer-to-peer support, where those survivors of suicide loss can come together and speak about their grief amongst others who are going through a similar type of thing. So obviously, if you're outside of Massachusetts, I do encourage you to see if those resources exist. But if you are local, please reach out to me, and I can put you in touch with my colleagues and try to get you some help.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you again to our audience members for sharing that. The other end of this age spectrum is we have somebody writing in, is there a way you help younger people that are feeling suicidal that's different from how you help adults? And sort of a second part of that is if there are specific resources for parents.
So let's see. It's a great question. I think what can happen often with youth is sometimes we fall into a trap of saying, when I was your age, or it's going to be okay, it's going to be better. Because it's so hard, because young people, like when I go to schools, they're sharing, they're writing down all of those risk factors that they're facing, all of those stressors, and there are those things. And sometimes for us as adults, we hear those problems, and sometimes they honestly feel trivial, and we're like, oh, you're not going to have to deal with that in a few years, or it's going to get better. But they don't know that necessarily, and their brains haven't developed enough to know necessarily how resilient they can be, or that they have the ability to get through these difficult things. So I would really encourage, doing that listening. Gosh, when I was a teenager, if my mom got me in the car that was the best place to get me to open up because I literally couldn't go anywhere. I hated it, but she got me every time. And so I think the listening is so important. I think a lot of young people don't feel heard, and they really want to feel heard. Sometimes in writing or texting, as much as many of us don't like texting to have deep, sort of intense conversations, writing a letter back and forth to each other, or texting, or saying, or maybe if they're not really comfortable, if you're a parent, for example, and it seems like they're not comfortable opening up to you, trying to see if there's even one adult that they feel comfortable opening up to, and telling them that they can always come to you, but sometimes they can feel awkward or uncomfortable going to your own parents. But let's brainstorm. Who could you go to if you were in a crisis? But you didn't feel like you could come to me. Maybe it's your aunt, maybe it's your English teacher, your guidance counselor, whoever. Trying to just have more support systems out there, and that listening is just so key. I don't know if that's helpful. Resources for parents. I know there's so many out there. Like here in Massachusetts, in the Boston area, something called Families for Depression Awareness, a really awesome group. NAMI, National Alliance of Mental Illness. They have a really great program for parents, which the name is escaping me right now. But wherever you're located, if you're a parent or really anybody, check out the NAMI branch in your area, see what they're doing. I have to believe there's a lot of resources and support groups for parents out there as well, and also reaching out to us, obviously, at Samaritans.
Thank you, Rose. And we are getting a bunch of questions about people in different parts of the country and specific resources in their area. So I'm glad you had a moment to speak to that. And of course, we can forward you a copy of this recording. You have access to this Rose's PowerPoint presentation in the handout section of your webinar. And are there any other resources that we should be sharing before we wrap up today's webinar?
Not that come to mind, but I mean, if you just do a little bit of Googling of either local suicide prevention organizations, local organizations that work with, mental illness, whether it's youth, whether it's adults, whether it's anybody. There's a lot of great websites, which of course I don't have the names in front of me, but a lot of websites that have some more like kind of step-by-step, how do you talk about this? I believe we also have some on our own website, which is up there on the screen. So.
Great.
Yeah.
That's very helpful. And to those of you that did submit a question today that we didn't have the time to get back in touch with you personally, again, Rose or a staff member will get in touch with you by tomorrow afternoon. But of course, if it's something more urgent, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Samaritans Hotline at 877-870-HOPE, which is 4673. Thank you so much, Rose, for taking the time to address this really important topic that touches so many people. And to our audience for taking time, thank you. And to our audience for taking time to learn about this. We do hope everybody stays in touch and has an enjoyable rest of the day. Take care. Thank you.